Hello, everyone. As I am going deeper and deeper into understanding what the future holds for all of us, I have with me a very, very special guest and friend, Aparna Piramal Raje, who was a senior of mine in school, somebody I looked up to from a very, very young age. So this interview is personally very emotional for me to have Aparna with us today. Aparna is a writer, a design thinker, and a mental health advocate. If you haven't got your hands on her book, Chemical Khichdi, I strongly recommend you read that book. Even if you're not suffering from mental health, it's just really a fabulous anecdotal, experiential book on her experience with mental health. She's also been a columnist with various publications, most prominently with Mint, talking about workspaces. So she's been a columnist and author for almost 14 years with Mint. And today she's going to be talking to us about the future of design, mental health, education, and business with her broad range of experiences. I also just want to add that her sister, her mom, and her have always been there for me at every point in my life and have been mentors for me and have always had my back. So, as always, Aparna, thank you for having my back once again. And thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Vibha.
Okay, terrific. All right, so Aparna, as we lay the context of this book and start thinking about, why is this conversation even important from your vantage point? Why talk about the future? Why is the future of work? Why look into the future?
Well, I think the most important skill for me, I would say, is curiosity. And I think talking about the future essentially implies a sense of curiosity and a sense of openness and wanting to learn new things. I mean, I think there are people out there who are futurists and whose business it is to make predictions about the future. I'm not one of them, but I like to think that I've got a very open mind and I'm very curious. And I think that's important to my profession, but I think it's important generally in life.
Okay, so from the way you see it, you're like, one must be curious, one must know what's going to come in the future. And of course, if from a professional perspective also, tapping into the future and at least trends in the future is important to you.
Absolutely.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so now as we think about the future, and we've done a series of interviews, different people have spoken about different factors that affect the future. We've heard comments on technology, sustainability, geopolitical, diversity, so many things coming up in the future. What are some of the future trends that you're seeing coming through? And more importantly, how are you seeing them pan out from your lens?
So I think everybody has a number of factors that affect their line of work. For me, I would say the ones that are most important would be demographics, then mental health, obviously, as we've talked about, creativity and empathy in the workplace, urbanization as another one, and then finally, of course, technology, which is probably the biggest one, but it affects everybody in different ways. So yeah, these five.
So do you want to pick any one or two and go a little bit deeper in terms of how you're seeing any of these pan out?
So I think we could, look at how they apply to all the different lines of work that I'm in. But let's just take something like demographics. That, let's say you look at workplaces, which I've been studying for many years. Now we're already in a situation where we have different generations in the workplace. But essentially what we're going to see, I feel, is even more of the social contract between the different generations being panned out differently. And I think that's going to be articulated much more. Already people are saying that it's much harder to get young generation workers, Gen Zs and younger workers, to put in the same kind of hours as older members of the workforce have done. So I think that extrapolating that trend, we're going to see a lot of different kinds of demographics, also relating to women in the workplace. That's the other one that's going to affect it. And we can talk more when we talk about the workplace.
Okay, terrific. So basically a generational shift in just approach and mindset towards work and working hours, etc., panning out. Okay, that's actually a very interesting point, and I want to touch upon that a little bit further. So we'll do it during the course of the conversation. Let me start with I've since you've done so many things, I've tried to break down these questions in terms of the different areas you've been involved in. Let's start with business. At the forefront, you come from a prominent business family. You've grown up around businessmen. You've grown up around academics. From a business perspective, what advice would you give to large and small businesses about being future ready? How should businesses, young entrepreneurs, think about the future and being future ready in terms of their businesses?
So I think, for young entrepreneurs, particularly, there is going to be a paradox between managing transactional efficiency at one end and then managing the need for human connection at the other end. So I think, especially when you are a young entrepreneur, you want to be efficient, you want to be quick, you want to be agile, you want to get things done, you want your teams to work properly. And that can often become quite transactional. Whereas when you start scaling up and you're going to have larger teams and more teams to manage, there's also needs for human connection because people have to then relate to each other. So managing that trade-off between human connection at one end and transactional efficiency at the other, especially as you scale up an organization and find the right balance. I particularly know from my own experience when I was in my 20s that I probably didn't invest enough on one-on-one time with my most senior leadership team. I should have done that a lot more in retrospect than what I did. But I was more worried about efficiency and trying to get things done, get everybody on board, commit to getting alignment. And I probably didn't spend as much time with them individually as I should have. So I think these kind of trade-offs in the future, that especially as we have technology that's going to make it even more easy for people to transact efficiently, I think that need for human connection also needs to be balanced. So these two, getting that balance right, I think is important. And that's what I call, building a high performing empathetic organization. Can you build an organization that is both high performing and empathetic? And I think that's what the future is going to be, where organizations actually focus on both these parameters.
Okay, so they're seeing the trade-off between transactional and high performance and still keeping that human connect alive, especially when people are working more and more hybrid, more and more remote. And then, of course, this world of co-botting where we're going to have machines take over large chunks of work. How do you still keep that human connection alive? Okay, that's a fabulous insight. Thank you for sharing that. And if I'm again from a business standpoint, and since you've extensively interviewed so many CEOs and corporate leaders in terms of their workspaces, how do you see work evolving generally in the future? And more importantly, how are you seeing workspaces change in the next 5 or 10 years?
I think COVID has really prompted us to examine what do we want from the office, and why are people coming into the office? Why are they staying in the office? Because I think it's just become so much easier to work from home. And I think this is a tussle that's really happening. And again, I think that coming back to this whole issue of managing paradoxes, I think we all have rights as individual knowledge workers, as individuals, but then we all have duties as corporate citizens. And I think that managing our rights and our duties, when it comes to what we're meant to do as corporate citizens and what we're meant to do as individuals, is going to be this balancing act. I think one of the CEOs that I interviewed said it's like a constant tango, and we have to learn how to tango together. And every organization will have its own rules based on its own culture of what really works for them going forward. But I think this conversation on that social contract has really begun, and it's not going to change, especially when we're referring to the demographics earlier. We're talking about young people. I was interviewing a CEO of a large investment bank, and he said that across the board, his peers are saying that the youngsters want to work different hours. And in my own team, I find this where, I've got somebody in their 20s working, and he'd be like, unless it's urgent, there's no need for us to really connect on the weekend. So unless there's something that requires it. So it's not that he's not willing to work on the weekends, and he does respond, but he's not expected to really be available. And I think it's a very, very different outlook. And we're going to see more of that. And related to that, I think work will become more bite-sized. So just like social media and the way we consume content is very bite-sized now. We're consuming content in short forms. I think work itself is more bite-sized, that you can have discrete amounts of work being done by different amounts of people working together. It's job sharing has always been there, but I think even more like you can get freelancers to do a piece of your work. You don't have to have those full-time full-time employees doing everything. So I think there's more bite-sized work. And the other thing is that I think we're becoming even more and more visual and storytelling led as people. So work itself is going to become more emphasis on that. I mean, if you go back to the generation of where people had really terrible PowerPoint presentations and you were just bored by them in the office, I think we're just going to see much more storytelling and a much more visual approach to work happening. Even in the corporate workplace, which still seems to love a lot of PowerPoint. So these are some of the sort of observations, I think, on the changing nature of work itself.
Okay. You spoke about the younger generation not wanting to work long hours and all wanting to work weekends. And there's Elon Musk, who's sort of going out and talking about there will be no jobs in the future. Like he thinks everything's going to be automated, and humanity is going to now come to this point where that basically no one has any jobs, and people are going to focus on just living the good life. People are going to listen to music and spend time on creative endeavors. Do you really see this as in the foreseeable future? Do you think this is something that might actually happen with people
I
not?
mean, if you talk to people, if you talk to people in the UK, for example, they'll tell you about the cost of living, and how that has got up. So unless everybody has a trust fund, I don't see how that they're going to manage in the future necessarily. I think it's those economies are not growing, and there's perhaps a certain context where Elon Musk is coming from. And yes, I think that people may have much more time and recreation, and there will be a lot more jobs in these industries of recreation and hospitality, tourism, art and culture, and sports, and all of these kind of will lead to new business models and careers that possibly didn't exist. But I just think that people will still always have to earn a living. They'll have responsibilities. I don't think that people will always have college fees to look after. So I think that there's always going to be a job for people like you, Vibha, to people aspire to go to college.
Thank
So
God. So I'm not being unemployed anytime in the future. But I like the point you raise about recreation and sport and all that becoming a much more pronounced industry, which definitely now and 10 years ago was not. They're fringe industries, and now you're saying they will come to the core, main front.
yes, definitely people will have disposable income and time for doing all these things for sure. But I just think that, we will all have to earn our living in different ways. But we do all have to earn a living. Yes. So
Okay, and then the second point you raised was about this sort of gig economy where you can have experts working on different pieces of work and not necessarily have to have them employed full time. So then in that sense, do you see more specialization happening in terms of careers and employment where people will try to specialize in one area and then offer that one expertise across different industries and companies? Or how are you
yeah,
seeing?
so earlier people used to talk about like career people being T-shaped, that they have depth in some areas and then they have breadth in certain areas. And I've tried to follow that in my career, where I developed depth and then my breadth expanded, and then I developed depth again. And but I think now people are saying it's more like a V, that you continuously expand even in your depth and you keep expanding. So that's why I said I think curiosity is the most important skill, because it's curiosity that in my case has led me. I started off in business, then I looked at design, then I was decided to do something in mental health. I started teaching. So it's always these curiosity that's led me to look at very different disciplines and connect them. And related to that, I think to really get value, I believe that you'll have to really look at the intersections of disciplines, because now things are not just so multidisciplinary. If you're looking at anything, you're looking at a number of disciplines coming together, and I think that's where really the value add lies. I mean, Steve Jobs, of course, showed that years ago with the way he was able to connect business, technology, and art and design. But we'll
Even
probably
more
see
like
much more of that.
so I'm hearing like two different voices. I'm hearing this T-shaped analogy a lot, but I'm also hearing what you said, right? Like just about people having one area of expertise, and then as the CEO or the manager, you try to build a team or assemble a team with people who have these different skill sets. So I think it's a little different from a managerial perspective, where you say, hey, the manager needs to be interdisciplinary because he might need to understand all of this. But what about the common man? What about like sort of the regular middle income person who's like, hey, I just want a job? Do you think even for the middle of the market, do you think they also need to have this T-shaped kind of skill building, or do you think given what you said about this gig economy, do you think they're just better off building expertise in one area and then saying, hey, this is it?
I don't think you can be static. I think that, if you start off with one skill, then you need to acquire. I see people now who have so many skills on their resumes, right? Doing a number of different things. And I think you can't afford, if you're a freelancer, of course, you can't afford to be static. You need to learn different. There could be allied disciplines. They don't all have to be as diverse as what I'm doing. But I think that you do need to learn and develop in more than one area. I think is quite important to develop that skill. And certainly if you want to grow, if you want to become a general manager or something in a company, you do need to have mastery of knowing all the other skills that are required to all the other parts of the value chain apart from the function in which you might have expertise.
Okay, all right, cool. Okay, so you are advocating for an interdisciplinary approach and trying to understand various skills and at least keep building in different areas.
Yeah, I mean, I've benefited from that, so that's what I would advocate for.
Okay, okay. And then the third thing you talked about was storytelling becoming more central to organizations. So since you touched upon this nerve on storytelling, how must an organization how do you think about this sort of storytelling in the future? Is this storytelling from a content creation perspective, like augmented reality, putting your business on the metaverse, and is that what you're suggesting, like moving from websites to now a more touch and feel virtual space of your company and your services? Or in what way are you thinking that storytelling will evolve? Because right now,
So storytelling, I don't, to be honest, I'm actually pretty behind the curve on technology. So I wouldn't say, I wouldn't be able to talk about some of the things that you just mentioned. But I just mean as a concept, I think that, very often when it comes to business, I think that if we can just create narratives about ourselves, literally tell stories in the workplace, it could, it's going to become much more powerful, because that's what's happening all the time on Instagram and on social media. People are essentially consuming stories all the time, right? 10-second stories, 20-second stories, 30-second stories, we're being primed. And I think the way to look at it was that, when in the generation which read a lot of books, everything was basically very audio related. But especially in India, and especially in our culture and with technology the way it's going, everything is very, very visual. So there could be a technological aspect to it, but I'm just saying, using stories to talk about your brand, to talk about your business in various ways. Even, for example, space can be a very narrative medium without even using technology, right? The workspace itself can tell a huge story about an individual, about a company, about a brand, all of these things. So I'm just saying that the whole idea of using the storytelling technique and taking those ideas from social media into the workplace could be something that people might start doing, and not just relying on data primarily, or merging stories with data. Stories and data can obviously go really, really well together. Some of the world's best thought leaders and experts do that all the time. So using that as a tool, as a device to really connect with people. Again, going back to that idea of building connections.
Okay, okay, okay. So you're saying the medium will vary depending on what technology evolves. The medium is sort of almost irrelevant, because in every year you see something new evolve, and then that the old one will become redundant. But you're saying storytelling will be central to organizations, and so it looks like it's more of an emotional connect with not just your customers but your employees and every sort of stakeholder within the organization. Okay.
I hope so. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, let's talk a little bit about design, since you did that column for so many years. What trends are you seeing? You've had so many interviews, you've seen so many workspaces. What trends are you seeing in terms of the workspace and how that's evolving? And more importantly, are you seeing the office itself as an entity become redundant, or do you see the office spaces stay in the next 5 or 10 years, and then you feel like this COVID thing was sort of a blip and it's gone?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's far from redundant. I think that many organizations want their people back 5 days a week. I've seen big investments happening by companies into really state-of-the-art workplaces after COVID, whether they're companies like a SAP Labs or an Avendus or a BCG or a Dream 11, a variety of companies, right, from multinationals to local startups and, local enterprises. I think that, as I said, for all these reasons, right? Because I think we're just social people, we're humans, we need to connect with each other, and it is an efficient way of getting things done. Having said that, I think people are just putting a lot more thought as to what exactly is needed for work to happen in this new hybrid technology-led atmosphere, and I think that reflects each workplace, reflects each organization's culture, so they're different. But a lot more thought has to, gone into the fact that work is mobile, people are moving around. Why are they coming into the office? Can we have more spaces for meetings? Can we not have assigned seating? So a lot of these different trends are visible from that perspective. But clearly, I don't see the office, going away in a rush. I think that in certain parts of the world, you've seen occupancy really come down. But despite the fact that in India we have high commutes, and people may not may not be always in expanding the same way. I think when they decide to invest, I think they do feel they need the space to really
Okay.
show off what this organization is about.
Okay, so despite the inefficiencies in travel and transport across the country, you're saying the office space will remain. You're seeing massive investments being done by companies already.
I mean, yeah, and I think it balances out in the sense that in some cases you see a lot of co-working spaces happening, full co-working office spaces that are occupied by one company. So I think people do balance it out based on, for corporate headquarters, they may be making more of the investments, for the rest of the other office, less or so. And I think they are thinking about how much people are going to be coming into, what is the occupancy of the office going to be like. But I don't think offices are redundant. I don't think people are doing away with them. There's still people where people are still going to work, very much so.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is it connects with almost every other interview I've had where everyone's saying we want our people to come back, and there's
Yeah.
a movement across industry sectors, even tech, right? Where eventually for the developers it was like, hey, the developers really don't need to be around, but then the product managers are like, we need the developers here because it's just super inefficient. So I think that the whole COVID conversation that everyone thought like everyone's going to sort of stay at home and work, I think that's completely changing. At least that's the sense I'm getting from many conversations, and you seem to be echoing.
Yeah, I think the bigger question that remains actually is not so much about the office. The bigger question that remains is about flexibility, and how much flexibility do people have? Do they have to come in 5 days a week? Are they doing 3 days, 2 days, 4 days, where are they working? I think that is the bigger conversation that is more important, rather than just do we need, we definitely, even a consulting firm like a BCG, where it's people might be out 4 days a week, they still have a fabulous, really good office that they built in Gurgaon. Because they know that even if they're back in 1 or 2 days a week, they still need that space, right? So the bigger question, I think, is how much flexibility can people negotiate? Because I think that's what COVID really gave to a lot of people, which they didn't have before.
Okay, so you're seeing a lot more flexibility come through, and definitely management being open to having these
I
conversations.
mean, I think it's on the agenda. I don't know if it always succeeds, but I think it's definitely more important than it used to be.
Okay, and I want to go back to the design trends you were talking about, because I think that's very fascinating. And obviously, you've seen way more offices than I have seen, and way more workspaces. But from the few I've seen, you touched upon like a couple of design trends. Let's go a little bit deeper into how have you seen workspace design change?
I think generally, the biggest change, the number one change, is really the whole idea of collaboration. And what does that mean? So, what does collaboration mean to any organization? To some people, it could be that we just have 1 or 2 meeting rooms in an office full of 80 people. For other people, it means that we think about it really, really carefully, and we literally design different kind of spaces for different kinds of meetings. And I've seen some really creative options, whether it's an architect firm that had like a mini amphitheater in their office
Wow.
for everyone to meet, and their cafe was like a work cafe. Or I said, coming back to BCG, where they had literally a variety of different kinds of conference rooms, including a black room and a white room and a hexagonal room, and different kinds of spaces for different kinds of conversations. So I think that really there's been a lot of more thinking and creativity around collaboration and giving that, and also this balancing of the we and the me space in the office, that recognizing that people need the me space, not just the senior people, but people need private space to make calls. You need those phone booths, and then certain kinds of desks in certain spaces that give you privacy, also ergonomics, all the rest of that, versus that collaboration we space. So being able to balance that out, I think that's the biggest tension in many organizations, is having the resources to do both, to accommodate both those sets of needs.
Okay, the we versus the me. I like that. I'm gonna quote that in the book for sure. I actually exactly, the rooms that you talk about, I was at Dream 11's office, and they have exactly the same thing. They have rooms named after different teams, and then the vibe and the whole setup and the design is so different that the minute you step into the room, there's a certain emotion that it evokes. and then definitely it's going to have a play out on in terms of where the conversation goes. They also have a walking track
Yeah,
with.
I've seen the walking track. Dream 11 has a really great walking track. And the other cool thing Dream 11 does is that they recognize that the normal meeting rooms and the conference rooms they have should be able to accommodate huge sizes of teams. So that when you're having a presentation, you can have, it's not just the people sitting around the table, but it's also enough room for other people sitting around in the room, because nowadays team sizes have become larger. So many of their meeting spaces are flexible, that they can be, rooms can be merged to make a bigger room. And then
Correct.
there's enough space for the whole team to be seated there. So I think they're probably taking off on their whole idea of teams and sports and competition from there, and they kind of incorporate
How
that
are
into
you
their
seeing,
space.
the MD offices evolve? Because 20 years ago, the MD's office was like this corner office, very heavily on marble everywhere. It's like sort of like the MD sat in one corner, and then there's the rest of the office. And some days now you go to a tech company, and the CEO's desk or the founder's desk is somewhere in the middle of the space, and then suddenly you see a title saying, "Hey, this is where the CEO sits smack in the middle of the organization." Are you
Yeah,
seeing
I
this?
mean, that trend has been happening for some time now. The tech companies definitely led the way, but I started seeing that a while ago, actually. I think the first time I encountered a CEO who was sitting in an open plan workspace was actually the CEO of Procter and Gamble in India,
Wow.
Shantanu Khosla, and next to him was a box of diapers. And he was sitting right next to in the open, and that was in 2010. Or yeah, that was sometime I think around 2010 possibly, or around that time. So it's been happening for some time. I see what's happening now is that founders are realizing also that they need to make a lot of private calls. So
Mm.
while they sit out in the open, they do reserve a room that is shared between a few people where they can make their calls.
Okay.
Otherwise, they don't have that privacy to make that call, to do those, and especially when it comes to hiring or fundraising, you need privacy. So I see that setup also happening.
Okay. So
Generally, I see with the startups, though, that they're fairly frugal. They unless they've been really well funded or they're fairly mature, they don't actually have very lavish offices in terms of decor at all, and they do try and cram in the people as much as they can.
okay. So it goes back to your we and me thing. Right? You need some we space, and then you need some me space, and then it's always this interplay between the both, because the amount of collaboration required today is radically different from what it used to be. Since we're on the topic of design, and you've seen so many offices, are you seeing this element of sustainability in terms of usage of material, in terms of just garbage collection, in terms of just the emphasis on sustainability in the office space? Is that something you're seeing?
Yeah, so it was interesting when I wrote my first book, actually, in 2015. I think barely like 5% of CEOs or 10% of CEOs mainly would have really talked about building a hugely sustainable office and understanding what there is. So I think there's much more awareness now of talking about that. But I to look at sustainability as a strategic issue, like as a strategic business issue that can actually result in benefits to the bottom line, is not still everybody speaks that language unless they're really passionate about it. I met a CEO who had literally constructed a greenhouse in his office, and the air quality was, he was so particular about it, was better, and this then was as similar in his office to something like Switzerland, whereas this office was based in Delhi, and Delhi air quality is not like Switzerland.
Mm.
So he was really passionate about it, and he really got into which kind of plants were suitable for indoors, and did all sorts of studies, and was trying to show that this is something that is sustainable. So there are a few people like that, but I think in general people are trying to be more aware. But I'm not sure if it's a huge element of the mission statement yet.
Yet. Okay. Okay. All right. Great. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for sharing your views on design. Let's pick another area, and I know this area is very special to you. The area of mental health, and you work extensively in the area. You've published in the area. You're very familiar with this space. So, just before we jump into AI and technology, etc., what is going on in the mental health space, and how important of an issue do you think this is today, and where do you see this issue? Is this going to come more and more into the forefront in the next 5 or 7 years?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think that there have been so many reports about young people's mental health in particular is not great. Now, that can be attributed to all sorts of reasons, right? From social media and technology being, poor. But I know from my own anecdotal experiences how many people contact me, not just because of their mental health, but because of their teenagers or their young adults' mental health. So I think that the challenge is really, again, going back to the issue of demographics, is that we have different generations that think about mental health differently. We have an older generation, who may not, who feel that they don't necessarily have the language to talk about mental health. The culture is not to talk about it openly, and sometimes they might be skeptical of issues like anxiety. They might think that young people are not being resilient enough. So there's skepticism at some end, or there's an unfamiliarity. They're not sure what terminology to use. And then there is our generation, which I think has much more exposure when we're trying to come to terms with all of these, with this as an issue. We may have family members who have been affected by it. And then we've got a young generation that, especially parts of our country, not everywhere, but who are very familiar with social media, they're familiar what's happening everywhere in the world. They're exposed to counseling through the school. They use words like triggered very easily. They say things like, oh, I'm depressed, or I've got anxiety, I've got ADHD, I'm bipolar. So it's very easy for them and to be very casual about the language that they use. So I think that we have a variety of different approaches to mental health and where people are looking at it. But I think overall, there definitely is much more awareness and willingness to talk about these issues than what I have certainly lived with for a very long time.
Okay. So we've seen a massive generation shift for sure, for between our grandparents, parents, our generation, and definitely the teenagers that I interact with. Lots of teenagers, exactly as you said, they speak very openly about it. They talk about their therapists very openly. They talk about opinions that therapists gave. They'll try to justify, grades in school or a test, saying, I got triggered that day, and that's why I have a C on my math test. And it's as you're saying, it's becoming more and more acceptable to have these conversations. Schools are having them. Uh, do you think this is going to become more and more sort of mainstream going forward? Do you think schools are going to have to do, and parents are going to have to do a lot more work in this space, or do you think it's going to skip a generation, and after this generation, is it going to sort of, is the tide going to turn around again? Like, where do you think this is going?
I actually wouldn't. I'm not sure where it's definitely going with this, but I don't know what the young, the sort of the next gen beyond these younger generations are going to be. But I do think the one thing that I think is really important as a skill to be built is the idea of resilience. And I think that that's really, really important. That we were just taught so much about success, and we were just not taught about failure. And I think that how to deal with failure is something that I believe all schools, all parents, that is something that children should have the opportunity to learn how to deal with failure. And I think that that's a very important life skill in building one's, investing in one's and enhancing one's mental health and well-being.
Okay. But a lot of the kids I work with, I mean, they'd say that they're resilient, but exactly how you've discussed also in your book, it is a chemical reaction. So, they're just like, we're incapable of doing anything when an episode triggers. So in that sort of case, like, who does the onus lie on? And I'm just trying to think, like, is this something the schools are going to have to be better prepared for in the future? Is it something families need to be better equipped with? Is the government going to now step in and say, look, we really need to set up large scale mental health institutions? Like, where is this going? How is this ecosystem going to evolve? Or private sector going to come in and set up large scale clinics? Because this is a critical issue, and it's becoming more and more mainstream. So how
Yeah.
is the system?
I mean, I think it's really important when it comes to mental health to have a mental health professional on board. and I think if it means having more therapists, and certainly they're having more demand for them, that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing, but I think it's really important to have a sense of, if as a parent, like, get a sense of diagnosis, of what is this, something that is a serious issue, or is this something that is not a serious issue? I think it's important to just be able to distinguish between those. Um,
So getting an expert or a specialist on board is probably a good idea. Okay, since you
Yeah.
touched upon experts and specialists, a lot of the sectors we've been speaking with people in like doctors and stuff. There's a lot of talk in the healthcare space about AI coming in, and then you have the sort of virtual doctor. He diagnoses you based on years and years and years of data that's been fed into this. Like as someone who understands the space from the inside out, do you think this is some sort of probable future? And would you really talk to an AI fed automated machine that has the benefit of a million cases from all across the world? Would you
Yeah.
talk to somebody like
I
that?
mean, it's happening now. It's not the future, right? There are already companies that out there that are doing it. So recently I was speaking with somebody that does one of these chatbot companies, AI companies, and he said that they've had millions, if not close to maybe 500 million conversations across the world. This is a company that has its roots in Bangalore as well as globally. And what they said was that, there's a whole huge group of people who are not perhaps at the stage where they need to see a therapist or a doctor, but they do have some issues that they're trying to work out. And that is where these kind of interventions are really helpful. And when you reach a stage where you need to see a doctor and get medical advice, and obviously you need to do that. So these are not a substitute for that. But there's a lot of that in between stage where you're not sure who to talk to. So instead of perhaps talking to a friend, you could talk to something that has these capabilities. I myself have not really used too much of AI while in my sort of healing and recovery journey. I've had access to actual therapists and to psychiatrists, but the fact that there is a need, and this is a global, there's a huge amount of the population that requires this need, and we simply don't have enough resources, and people do not have the kind of resources also to access and pay for therapy, then at least this could be something that would work if it's properly tested.
Okay, okay. So you're saying that if they build a good tool, if it's tested well enough, the data
Yeah,
set.
these tools are being these tools are being used by organizations like the NHS. So it's not like they're not being used by medical institutions. I think that we have to embrace the technology for sure. But how we take care of biases, how we really program it, there's a certain responsibility that comes with producing this kind of technology, which I'm sure people who some people have it and some people don't. I'm sure there'll be all kinds of products and services out in the market. Yeah.
Okay, so eventually you have to embrace technology. It gives you scale, it gives you access, lowers the cost, and at least makes it affordable for large chunks of the population. And you said at least to a certain point, you can rely on a tool, and then if you need to get human intervention, that can come at a at least.
Yeah. But I also say, and I've said this before, like just the phone rings all over the place here. This I've also said that we are maybe a chatbot nation, but we are also a chatterbox nation. And I think that there really is a role for people to be trained as mental health champions, and certain nonprofits are doing that already in various parts of the country. Those kind of solutions also, if they could be scaled, could help to solve these kind of problems in the future.
Okay, okay. So definitely a booming sector, a large sector that people could look to going forward. How do you think that, like, you pin down, potentially social media as one of the causes for this sort of, explosion in the mental health space? What's going to happen in the future when, you're largely spending, most of your time interacting with a machine, you're using these bots to do your work. So right now, it seems more of like at least the teenagers, I guess, more vocal about it, but it seems like something that's affecting, or at least between the age of 12 and 20, I'm seeing a lot more conversations. But this will then, with a minute, 30, 40, 50 year olds start using their machines, Are you seeing, with the advent of more technology, more AI, more botification in organizations, is this issue just going to escalate going forward?
I think, yeah, I think we're going to have to become much more skilled at weaning ourselves off it, and this technology is not designed to be weaned off, right? Although there are some alarms and things that you can set, but I think generally we have to be more conscious, and it's really tough. I've been trying to lower my, overall my screen time over the last couple of months, and I did well, then it started going back up. So I think we're going to have to be really conscious about it. For social media and per se, what I would say is that there's been huge amounts of data that shows how bad and damaging it is for children's mental health and teenagers' mental health. That, I think that if there are kids who start using them as young as 6, and I think that their mental health is something like 50 to 75% worse than what it could have been without, have they started a little bit later. So there are lots of studies, announced around smartphones, social media, and mental health. So I think we really have to try and live in the real world as much as possible.
Okay. Live in the real
Make
world,
the effort to do that. Yeah.
more human experiences, more self-regulation, and trying to set up strategies to sort of stay away and wean off. Okay, great. Okay, let's move to the last section of this conversation, which is a very important part of the conversation because we've talked about trends and what's coming in the future. This section, you touched upon a couple of these skills, but let's go a little bit deeper and talk about, what are some of the skills that you would suggest somebody young equip themselves with as they sort of get themselves ready for the future in terms of future readiness. So you talked about resilience. I know that seems to be something big, and you talked about curiosity through the conversation. Is there anything else you want to add? And we can also talk about that V-shaped.
Yeah. Well, I think this idea, the curiosity is the whole idea of being V-shaped, right? That you can that you're learning about different things all the time, and fundamentally that you think of yourself as a learner, that it's not, and that you think of that you are always a lifelong learner, and there are things that you want to grow, and life is about growth. And I think if you adopt that very viewpoint, it's a very positive viewpoint. It's one where you're taking charge of yourself rather than blaming, what didn't happen on external circumstances. The other thing I think is very important is empathy. And I think that obviously empathy is very important for design. Empathy is very important for mental health. So two of the disciplines that I'm very, closely associated with. But I just think an outlook of being able to empathize is going to start becoming important, especially in a world that is becoming more transactional and tech-led. We should look at empathy. And I'm not the only one who said this. I mean, Satya Nadella, when asked about AI recently, he said that it's not just about having an engineer, it's about having an engineer who understands how humans think. So I think this skill of having empathy is really important as a life skill.
Okay. It seems like that's is the one skill, at least as of now, that they haven't been able to codify. So if we want to keep human supremacy over technology, if we keep the EQ quotient running high, then hopefully, at least in the foreseeable future, humans will stay ahead of the game. Um, tell me, I always been asking this question to everyone. If you had to go back to college, I know you went to Oxford and did your undergrad there, and then you went to Harvard Business School. But if you had to go back, and now that you know so much about the world and so much about the future, and you've got your eyes on what's coming in the next, in the next couple of years, what would you go back and study? Would you change your course of study? What would you have liked to study if you were going to college now?
Well, I think if I was at business school, I would have spent more time understanding family businesses. I didn't do enough of that at that time, the psychology of that. I still say that what I studied then, I still love. I think it's one of the best degrees in the world. It's been around for 500 years. So I don't think, technology or AI is going to change that. But I studied politics, philosophy, and economics, and they were just a wonderful combination of liberal arts taught in a most interesting way. So I would not change that, actually. I think that it was a good thing. But I'm glad I got exposed to design when I did, because a lot of people, I think, particularly in the subcontinent, generally, we come to life either from a science background or a STEM background, or a management background, which is, essentially also a lot based on liberal arts and economics and things like that. But the design world has given me a whole different point of view. So I'm glad I got that exposure in my 20s, which I may not have otherwise got that. So I'm very, very grateful for that, because that has changed the way I look at the world completely.
Okay, so if you had to go back, you would go back. I mean, you essentially had three disciplines. You had philosophy, politics, and economics. So in your one degree, you have already had three encapsulated within them.
Yeah,
You would go back and do just the same.
I'll do that. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting, because I interviewed this professor from UCSD. He heads the computer science department there. And when I asked him this question, he said people should study what's been around. Like, go study history, go study politics, have philosophy, because at least your degree is not going to get redundant. He said if you go study AI will get redundant in 5 years and you'll be out of a job. So I think what you're saying is coming from in many areas, and also, as we said, embedded within your one degree were already three interdisciplinary fields.
I think I learned to connect the dots there.
Yeah.
I learned to connect the dots, because that's what we had to do. We studied these individual disciplines and then we eventually connected the dots between them. And I think that was really good.
Okay. All right. Last question as we close this out. If you had to give just general advice from your perspective to somebody young, what, as people are anxious, people are worried about, what's coming. People are worried about technology taking over their jobs. There's a lot of anxiety generally built into the system. Firstly, are you optimistic about the future or not? And then what advice would you give to somebody young as they're, sort of setting their eyes ready and getting ready for the future?
Yeah, I'm always optimistic about the future. I think I am, that's what I'm saying. People who come from a design background are always optimistic. There is a very famous line that we are here to be architects of the future, not victims of it. So I think that I come from that frame of mind. For the people in the future, I would say just be prepared to do jobs that don't exist right now. I would say that, for example, I could not have imagined that I would be a design thinker or I'd be a design writer. 20 years ago, there's just no way I would have thought of that. Or even being a mental health advocate, I really had not anticipated that for myself. So just be prepared to do jobs that either don't really exist, to invent them, to create them, to come up with them, not be afraid of them. And the second thing is, I think that underpinning that is really to find purpose. And it's really, the purpose of life is a life of purpose. So if you can find purpose, then that will take you in that direction of letting you do things that don't already exist. So I think it's really important to feel that you can create your future, not be a victim of it, and that you can find the purpose that underlines it.
Okay, I think this is a beautiful end to this conversation. Hopefully we can all be architects of our future and not be threatened by what's coming. Beautiful words, Aparna. Thank you so much once again for doing this. And that was a lot of food for thought. So thank you. And I'm going to try and weave in everything you said into the narrative. But thank you so much for doing this, and look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.